appreciate the invitation, and I hope the last lecture today is going to be a memorable one. And if you're going to leave during my lecture for planes, just remember early child development is the key to lifelong prosperity and wellness. That's the message that I'm going to give you today. But I'm going to also wrap it up in some science and some context. Working as a pediatrician and as a public health leader, I'm able to look at both lenses of child health, child development, and at the population level, and intermingling some of the concepts that we have in public health that I sort of spin through the child development and life course perspective. So this is something that I've been doing for many years. And as we'll see later, I'm delighted that the message is starting to catch on a national and an international level. And so, you know, one of the things that Frederick Douglass said, it's not a new concept. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men or women, for that matter. I think it's a bit sexist, but I'll change it. That was the original quote. So I think that one of the things I want to tell you is the journey that has got me here and has blinded the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Bank to write the series in Lancet, which I hope you can look up and find. It was published in October of 2016, and it started with a commentary, a good start in life will ensure a sustainable future for all. And this was serendipitous. I had worked with the United Nations a couple of years before on a book that I wrote, and I'm also the advisor at the Fraser Mustard Institute of Human Development. And Stephen Lai and I were trying to push the United Nations to kind of put this at the forefront. I think it's important. I've actually given this lecture to former Prime Minister Harper. I've given this to Justin Trudeau as well. This is something we need to advocate for collectively, and I'll build a case for you all, which I'm sure you're not going to be difficult to convince. I'm sure this is an audience that I think does important work at all levels of child health and development, prenatal, postnatal, and it's very important. So this Lancet series is kind of putting us on the map now. What we've been talking about kind of, you know, here and there is becoming more and more of a momentum. And they essentially are saying that early child development is the next world's preoccupation after climate change. This is the next challenge that we have. And that applies to Canada and unfortunately worse off in developing countries. So I can't give a lecture about population health and health in general without talking a bit about in public health what we refer to as the social determinants of health. So what makes you healthy or unhealthy? And a lot of the people seem to think that, you know, it's your health, it's your medical biology and so on. But no, they're wrong. At least 70% of what makes you healthy or unhealthy has nothing to do with your biology. It has to do with your environment. It has to do with your social environment, physical conditions, working conditions, how much money you make, how much education you have, social capital, access to healthcare, and so on. So these are what we call the social determinants of health. And one of the things that I'm struggling with as a public health leader is that this crosses sectors, and I'll talk about a cross-sectoral approach as well, because you're crossing sectors. You're looking at finance, you're looking at education, you're looking at housing, you're looking at social community, you know, all these ministries that sometimes don't talk to each other, but you're dealing with the same problem. It's the social determinants of health that determine one's health and one's family's health as well. So that's something that I always, you know, put down as a sort of a basic foundation of where I think a lot of the work that we can do, it needs to be more cohesive, more collective, and integrated in terms of that common goal of supporting the families and supporting their kids. So if you look at it through the factors that influence early child development, so these are the determinants of health. As you can see, all of these here, biologic, genetic, endowment, fine, but you know, I'll teach you that genetic changes, there's epigenetic changes that can occur. Temperament, parenting skills, physical environment, significant stressors, social supports or lack thereof, abuse or neglect, family relationships, attachment or lack thereof, all of these are determined by the social determinants of health, affected one way or the other, adversely or positively. So I'm putting a spin through these factors, looking at the multifactorial effects, and I'm going to be talking about how they, globally, in general, foster either good health or bad health, and how our paradigm of understanding chronic disease has changed based on some of the scientific data and scientific studies that we've seen. So I'm just going to give you a quick example. This is you're familiar with the EDI scores, Orford Center. I'm just giving you this as an example because in our area, there are certain pockets of the population, and you can see Eastern Ontario is at the tip, is right at the tip of Eastern Ontario, and we represent about 250,000 people or so. And we have demographics that are quite unfavorable. We have the highest rates of chronic disease, hypertension, smoking, I mean, you name it, as compared to the rest of Ontario. And particularly in the areas of Hawkesbury and Cornwall, we have kids who are vulnerable in terms of language and cognitive development, for example, much more predominantly than the rest of Ontario. And that's not a coincidence. Conversely, you can see if you have the domain, one or more domains that are vulnerable, we see 42% in Hawkesbury and almost 40% in Cornwall, where the Ontario average is 27%. So if I were to flip it over, you can actually look at the socioeconomic profile and you could actually see a disparity. And it's true that if you look at it in general, the lower your socioeconomic status, the higher your percentage of vulnerable children in terms of early development and early development challenges and problems in these kids. So we have very high rates of kids not develop, speech doesn't develop properly, language, cognitive expression, all these things that we see that are a direct result of those pockets of the population, most of which are 22% of our families are single mothers. And it's really, and that's where we see the problems, and it's a vicious cycle that's created. So when I give this talk, when I started to give this talk a couple of years ago, people would say, okay, so what do we do with this? What does this mean? What do the poor EDI scores reflect? Aside from the fact that can't the child catch up? You can give some remedial help to the child. Will the child, maybe prosper in school? Well, if the child starts off on the wrong foot, chances are that you need a lot of help to bring the child back. Yes, kids are resilient. There are issues there as well. But what we now know, that biological mechanisms which are activated by circumstances of disadvantage are the immediate causes of the misdevelopment of the brains and the modification of the gene expression. So what this does, it translates, actually gives us a link between early events, and I know that some of you went to my colleague Jean Clinton talk yesterday about ACE and the adverse childhood events and so on. All of these events and illness, these actually give you poor functioning later on in life. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm going to explain that what we do today will have an impact 30, 40, 50 years down the line, which is an important impact, and hence it requires us to pay attention to those early years. So traditionally, we've been looking at childhood socioeconomic studies and mechanisms of physical, adult physical outcomes. We're thinking, the psychological issues of neglect and abuse. There are problems with health behavior and so on. And then, we've added now a paradigm shift where you're looking at physiological changes that occur that are not readily seen at birth, but probably will manifest themselves 30, 40 years down the line. And I'll explain to you how that occurs. And so the first 20, I call it the first 27 months of life, or the United Nations calls it the first 1,000 days. Essentially, it talks about the vulnerable period of extreme development and vigorous development, 9 months prenatally, 18 months postnatally. I focus on the first 18 months postnatally because that's where a lot of action happens in the brain, and I'll explain that as well. Of course, progression goes on and development goes on up to the age of 25. But a lot of the brain, a lot of the development, a lot of the pathways, a lot of the structures, a lot of the sculpting of the brain, the wiring of the brain, occurs within the first 2 years of life. And it's not a surprise that a 2-year-old has the head circumference, 80% head circumference size of an adult. So you're not 80% of your size at 2, but the head is your adult size. So it just goes to show you the rate of growth that occurs. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at this sort of early brain development, neurobiology, and the science tells us that the neurobiology and the neurodevelopment is very, very finicky. it requires that the nerves that we're born with, the nerve cells that we're born with, they don't multiply, they just connect. And they connect and they form pathways. And the pathways form other pathways. And they build this foundation of cognitive functioning, all kinds of things that we see. And so we know that the science will tell us about the early brain development, there's going to be disruption, there's going to be hormonal changes and gene expression, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, on some of the things that can occur. And again, sort of bringing the science through is important, because we can all say, and it's intuitive, yeah, obviously if a child has an issue, a mental issue, or something happens to the child's development, something's going to happen later on in life. A lot of people would think that if there's neglect or abuse, that it's likely psychological, but it's also going to be physical. And so when you're talking, when the Lancet talks about early childhood development, looking at science and looking at scientifically through a life course, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So we talked about the first 18 months, and we see here, and this is a slide that my colleague, a lot of my colleagues use, but it just shows you that by 18 months of age, most of the pathways, vision, central auditory system, habitual ways of responding, emotional control, emotional regulation, peer social skills, etc., are formed. They peak by around 18 months. It's not to say that there's no other formation later on, but that peaks and maximizes. And so very often I have arguments with the ministry when they want to do the 18-month checkup or the 36-month checkup. I said, well, sometimes maybe it's too late at 18 months. Maybe we should be looking at earlier, intervening earlier. And what we're seeing is these kids with EDI scores at 5 years of age, it probably reflects something going on during their very important formative years. And basically, it's the window of opportunity. This is the window of opportunity. When I talk to parents about this, I spin it positively. I said that, obviously this is where you can do your best to promote that brain development. And how does that brain development occur? Actually, it's stimulated by not neglecting the baby, by responding to a baby, by looking at a baby, by playing with a baby, by holding a baby. All those things, all those factors require that. And unfortunately, that's why I put the red arrow there. It could be halted, or there could be misdevelopment, or there could be all kinds of problems if a child is neglected, abused, and so on. So this is our opportunity, and this is where we collectively need to support this period. When I say support this period, it means support them in providing a nurturing environment. And that is a public health statement. It's not just it's a very political statement when I talk about it. And that's why when I spoke to the Prime Minister, he said, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to make it that every parent can hug their child all the time. And he laughed. And I explained to him, it's a very political statement that I'm telling you. It talks about multi-sectorial cooperation and allowing a nurturing environment and fostering a nurturing environment. And if you recall, just to show you, remember I showed you the disparities that occurred between rich and poor. Those we see in Canada, those we see in the United States. We don't see those in countries like Sweden, Scandinavian countries. There's no divide, there's no disparity between EDI scores based on socioeconomic status. Because they have a very, very important and rich social network that supports parents, who then in turn provide a nurturing environment to their baby. That's really the key that we're trying to achieve here. So there's going to be, like I said, just to show you sort of a brief kind of overview of the neurophysiology of the brain. Before 30 months of age, the right hemisphere develops. After 24 months of age, you get the left, so language is there. So it kind of tells us, we kind of know when the periods occur. We know that the right hemisphere is instrumental for empathetic perception of emotional states of other human beings. We recognize another individual's emotional state by generating representations that stimulate how the individual would feel when displaying a certain facial expression. So essentially, we smile at a baby, it's good for the baby. The baby smiles back. And there's a video that my colleague shares where you see actually a series of stills where this baby, 7-day-old baby, lying down and kind of face-to-face with a father, or a grandfather. I don't know if you've seen it. And you could actually see the baby responding at 7 days of age to the contact. The grandfather, opens his eyes brightly, the baby opens brightly. The father starts to open, the grandfather opens them up, the baby does it as well. At 7 days. And what that does is that actually stimulates and promotes positively that sculpting of the brain. That will then be the foundation for the child's personality, for the child's ability to learn, and for the child's health, physical health as well. And that's a new paradigm. The ladder that I talked about is a new paradigm. So again, the right hemisphere development and early attachment. Most of the development occurs by almost 3 years of age. The right hemisphere is dominant front conscious process and so on. And this process is really required. It requires attachment. So for the rest of the lifespan, the brain plays a big role, and the physiological and endocrinological functions that I'll explain to you. But the attachment relationship, and that's important, directly shapes the maturation of the right breast and the brain, which is a stress coping system. And I'll talk a bit about that. In medical terms, it's the HPA, the hypopituitary adrenal axis, which is basically our adrenaline, steroid, cortisol, stress hormone regulatory process. So when I talk to parents about it, I say, well, let's talk about the science of tender loving care, the science of TLC. Why scientifically tender loving care makes a difference to your baby. So we know that infants prefer human face. They need it face to face. It promotes right brain activity. They can scan a face, as you see, as you know. Even early on, they know. They try to evoke a response. If you're like this, if you're stressed, they will pick it up. Or when you speak, they will shift to you. They want to look for emotional regulation. They try to build those things. Micro expressions are important. Any small expression, twinkling the eye, or twinkle the baby's eye. Those type of things are very important in doing that. And like I said, by 2 days of age, the smell, taste, hearing form the basis of an infant's recognition. Tactile, that's why breastfeeding is important. Contact is essential. Otherwise, babies will fail to thrive. And I'll give you some examples that I've actually had to take care of babies. And after that, they develop, the cortex, they develop pupil size, and the pupil size depends on face-to-face cognition, and so on. So it's very important that the day-to-day stimulations are nurturing, interesting, and stable home life. You see, nurturing, interesting, and stable home life most certainly can sculpt the brain circuitry. That's one of the important things. Reading, singing, cuddling a child help in a very positive way to shape the baby's neurobiology, okay? The formation. For example, a baby, and I tell parents this all the time, read to your baby. Read to your baby from day one of life. Just read. Read the paper, read it, whatever. Just read to your baby. Because we know that the number of words that a baby hears determines, at 3 years of age, determines school performance. So that's very important. So I tell them to read, and there are divides. You can look at, again, socioeconomic divides, where there's millions of words in discrepancy between certain neighborhoods. And in most situations, it has to do with socioeconomic status. However, there's a subpopulation of those babies who have less words than the others, whose parents work, whose parents are well off, but they're so busy, they don't read to the child. So it's not that poverty causes it, but obviously the other things can do it as well. In other words, causing you to neglect the child or not to read enough. So we know that the attachment will stimulate the growth hormones in the brain. It'll actually help exploring the environment, taking a chance. And it's very important that it is sort of, all of these things occur in a secure way because attachment to a person allows formation of healthy relationships. It increases emotional expression. It teaches emotional regulation. All of these things are very important. That's what tender loving care does. And we do know that these babies, if what they would need, and I'll talk about, I had a thought that I lost, but I'll get it back. Has to do with the iPads. I'll talk to you about that. I'll just take a sip of water. What happens is it's called a serve and return. How you stimulate a baby. So in order to hear, in order to speak, you got to hear. In order to see, you got to be stimulated. So it's kind of a two-way approach where it goes back and forth: sound, vision, smell, touch, proprioception, all of these things. Proprioception is kind of the ability to estimate distances and that type of thing. And that's why, that reminds me, you need to have tactile stimulation as well. Somebody asked me, at what age can my baby play with an iPad? And I said, well, technically, 9-month-olds could do it. Like, they could actually figure it out. But I said, obviously, I don't want that to happen, because what we need to do is we need to go and do old-fashioned play. Play blocks, go on the floor, play tactile, all these things. Interaction, human interaction. They need that. It doesn't replace, a story being read to them on an iPad will not replace the one-to-one, because the one-to-one is the eye contact, it's the tactile, it's all the other things that are occurring. So it's very important for us to understand that, and that's why, of course, we promote breastfeeding, aside from all the other benefits, because that's what it does, right? Give me an example. So, vision and hearing, okay? I had a cataract operation a couple of years ago, and I can see very well now. Babies who are born with cataracts, if you don't repair them right away, they'll be blind forever. Why? Because the optic nerve needs to see, to be developed. So that's important, right? That's a fair example. Babies who have cochlear defect, babies who can't hear, can't speak, we know that. So that's what I mean by that give and take relationship that occurs. I'll give you some other examples that I've seen myself. Actually, small for gestational age babies who are intrauterine growth retardation, low birth weight, etc. They did a longitudinal study at Johns Hopkins, and they actually found out that when they were in their 40s and 50s, these babies who, despite looking normal, very often I would see a baby born at 4.5 pounds, but full term, look normal, caught up in terms of development and growth. But the studies show that around 40 and 50 years of age, these babies, as compared to their normal birth weight cohorts, have higher rates of metabolic syndrome, hypertension, diabetes, and so on. And even some studies suggest cancers as well. So there is something going on in the intrauterine period. Remember I talked to you about the 9 and 18 months and the 27 months paradigm there? That's going on that you don't see right away. So if mother took thalidomide, you'd see it right away, baby comes out with no limbs. It's a drastic example, but it's an example that signifies immediate effects versus long-term effects. Whereas you can't see that the child will be predisposed to heart problems or metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and so on. And which brings me to the next one. A University of Toronto study of the sick kids looked at kids and followed them through their adult lives, 40 and 50, and correlated that those adults that were abused as children, young children, had higher rates of heart disease than the kids who were not. So it also shows you that the effects are not obvious to the invisible stress, toxic stress, and so on that we see. Obviously, physical punishment and physical abuse is different, but the other effects that I'm talking about of neglect and not paying attention can only sometimes be seen later on in life. The other thing that I've personally experienced is when I was working at the Montreal Children's Hospital, we would admit babies, 2-month-old baby that was the same weight as birth. And, that's not normal, obviously, but the baby looked well. The baby looked well hydrated, the baby didn't look sick. So we admitted the baby to the hospital and followed the baby, and within a day or two, the baby started gaining weight again. Why? Because the nurses, during the break, would hug the baby and give the baby tender loving care, feed the baby, and the baby would start to grow. So I talked about it before. So deprivation, emotional deprivation, can actually stunt a baby's growth acutely like that. I've seen it, and it's not just once. I had about 3 or 4 cases when I was practicing in Montreal. So what can go wrong? So obviously, when I talk to parents, I spin more what can go right, but I just want to show this audience what can go wrong, because it's a multifaceted thing that can go wrong. Multiple problems, all the social interactions, the social issues will affect this. So we know now that the science really tells us that abuse and neglect, disadvantage, has effects. There's long-term, which are not immediately visible effects. Obviously, the psychological, which is the classic view. But we have a new paradigm. The disruption of that formation of the brain, particularly the sculpting of the brain hormonal control, the stress hormonal control, can result in hormonal disbalances and chronic disease later on in life. And the genes can be modified. The DNA can be modified, which will then result in the genes, the DNA genes that make RNA, which make proteins in tissue, something's wrong with the tissue. We don't understand the whole trail, but we do know that we can pick up abnormalities of the DNA on kids who have had neglect or abuse. It's been shown in animal studies and so on. So, allostasis. I want to talk a bit about allostasis because it is what we see and what explains. Remember I told you that in my area we have higher rates of heart disease, hypertension than the rest of Ontario and so on. It's not a coincidence. This is a deprived, vulnerable community, high risk people, single mothers, poverty and so on. And we know that ordinarily our brain system, so if I were to put up a shocking image up here now and scare everybody, your hormone levels will go up, and then they go down. And that's what's called homeostasis, the balance. When the baby's brain is altered, and you'll see why later on, the baby is developing, and that stress control is not normal. It's kind of set at a higher rate due to some kind of external toxic stress. It becomes much higher. So what happens is the control, the threshold, if you'd like, of having that whole circuitry of stress hormones released is much, much lower. So they're constantly having this hormonal surge. And we know that in the absence of sort of any brain issues from the beginning, in adults as well, recurrent hormonal surges that we can see, recurrent hormonal surges can actually damage the tissue. And that's how we think that patients or populations who live in poverty, who live in disadvantage and so on, and who are always stressed, have that higher threshold, have that higher level, and that, the cortisol, the adrenaline, that gives tissue damage. And that's how we think the tissue damage occurs in the heart, metabolic syndrome, and so on. So that, in other words, it's if your HPA system is misdeveloped or maldeveloped, you're at higher risk for chronic disease. So this is why very often, we look at, it's no surprise that, again, I'll wear my public health hat, that when you look at populations, and these are Canadian populations, this is Canada, and when I was at Johns Hopkins, we talked about the social determinants of health, and we talked about disparities between rich and poor in terms of health outcomes. And they assumed that in Canada we have no disparities because we have universal health care. Well, universal health care doesn't cover the 70% of the social determinants of health. So we still have disparities. So this is a Canadian study here that looks at Canadians reporting health. And you can see the higher the income level, the higher the rate of positive response for good health. Premature deaths, longevity, and so on. The poorest die earlier than the richest. Again, this is BC, looking at the socioeconomic status. If you go from left to right, left is best, right is worst. So the worse you get off, the higher rates of premature deaths you get. This is in BC. And I could show you on and on. There's a whole slew of information about that. But just to put together, that's just to sort of explain that we think that it's because of that allostatic effect, that hormonal. So picture now an individual who has not had birth trauma will develop this, because if it's continually stressed, will do that. But picture if the baby then develops into that, he's even at higher risk because the brain hasn't developed properly. The HPA has not developed properly. So we need to ensure attachment and provide a useful internal working model. And this is a precursor of lifetime optimization and HPA axis and reduction in the allostatic load. So early on, the earlier on we can assure that the brain, the HPA axis is properly developed, the better it is in terms of the long term. And this is a new paradigm in chronic disease prevention. The next slide talks about epigenetics. And epigenetics is a relatively new field where we're looking at the DNA and the actual DNA molecules themselves, the actual adenosine, all the different ones, and there can be changes induced on the DNA by like another chemical additive, hydroxylation or acetylation, and so on. And those can be brought on by the social environment. They can. And we know that, and some of my colleagues at McGill have done their initial studies. And so we know that these epigenetics, and they're heritable. So once you have the DNA change, You can inherit that. You can actually, your children inherit it, other generations will inherit that. We saw that, we actually saw the DNA changes when they look back at the PEI famine farmers. They actually saw the genetic changes, the DNA changes when they look back to them. So you can get methylation. Essentially, the DNA molecule is modified. And when you modify the DNA, that is the precursor of your tissue, so whatever it is doing. So you can imagine that there can be abnormal translation of the DNA, which then turns into tissue and protein. So it'll really be, that has wild potential negative effects. Like I said, we don't fully understand the nitty-gritty of it, but you can imagine that if the DNA doesn't translate properly, you will have problems. So this is another example as well, social diet, etc., talking about transcription, just looking at the different levels of it. But this is important here. There's another one. They took two groups of rats, and one group, and in rats, nurturing affection is given by the mother licking the babies. And they put two groups of baby rats. One, they didn't allow the mother to lick the baby, and the other one they did. And they actually found that the non-licked babies, the babies who weren't showing affection, actually had changes to their DNA. So that's something that we're going to be looking at. And other studies that have looked at exposure to violence in childhood showed that the telomere is the end of the DNA, which is linked to how long you'll live, we think now, has actually eroded. So social exposure to violence, exposure to abuse, and so on, can actually affect your genes and affect your longevity. This is unbelievable. So the AIDS study, and I know that Jane Clinton talked about it yesterday, this is basically looking at the effects of childhood stress across the lifespan. And it's no surprise to anybody, really, that witnessing, violence at home from domestic violence has an impact on health and behavior. Those children experienced, they were likely to experience they clustered. What happens is a lot of these things cluster. Poverty, violence, drug abuse, food insecurity, home insecurity, and all that are clustered together. Frequency of witnessing IPV actually caused depression and drug use in those kids as well. And exposure to physical, sexual abuse and domestic abuse in childhood resulted in men being perpetrators as well, as you know. So we see that as well. So these are not unexpected. But now there's evidence to also talk about the long-term physical insults of this. So stress and the definition and consequences, essentially, it's internal and external influences that disrupt our normal state of being. That's kind of the definition of stress. And essentially, it can cause disease by leading to physiologic changes. We know that. We talked about it before. That stress hormone reaction. If I put a very scary image up here all of a sudden and shock you, your blood pressure will go up, your heart rate will go up, and there'll be a dramatic increase in those hormone levels. Now, if you persist to be in that's not good for you. If you're born with an abnormal system to begin with, it's even worse for you. So that's really the point. So toxic stress, and really it results from adverse experiences. So when I talk about stress, really it's invisible. It doesn't mean you hit the child. It's invisible. It's lack of neglect. It's neglect. I mean, look at the babies. Look at the Romanian orphans. When at 4 or 5 years of age, the orphans who were just left in cribs, their heads were much smaller than babies who were nurtured. That's because the brain can grow. Because the brain needs that stimulation. So toxic stress can cause disease over the long term, but importantly, it will disrupt early brain development. And that's very important. And in terms of, and it also will affect biological control systems as well, which will lead to long-term problems. This is a little video that talks a bit about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So it just gives you an idea of the effects. Like I said, stress affects everybody, obviously, but when you're talking about the child's developing brain, developing baby, you're actually talking much bigger and long-term repercussions. And you're talking not only, when I talk about this, talking about psychological, mental health. I believe that the root of mental health, chronic issues, the school issues, and so on, and even physical things can be linked to this period. So in one foul swoop, as we address these things, we can actually look at overall wellness, mental and physical wellness, and ensuring prosperity. And I'll talk a bit about that because over the life, when I wrap this up, you'll see what I mean by a life course trajectory and how we can help. So I want to finish the rest of the talk today talking about the life course perspective and how we can put it all together and how each and every one of us in this room can play a role, because it's important for us to understand the need for us to support and promote a nurturing environment. And like I said, it's a lot of things that get in the way. And then it's sometimes your agency may not be able to address, the family violence or the food insecurity or whatever. But that's why it's important that it has to be an intersectorial approach. So essentially, this is just a diagram that shows us the first 5 years of life. Again, school readiness, emotional, cognitive, and language function. These are kind of the things that occur and develop in the first couple of years of life. And obviously, the arrow itself. The dark arrow itself. The dark arrow itself. Sorry about that. Wrong button. The dark arrow itself shows you the trajectory of the child's natural trajectory or predisposed ability or capacity. And obviously, the red, poverty, lack of support, family discord. And I just want to talk a bit about poverty, because when I give this talk, and then people tell me, inevitably somebody gets up in the crowd and says, I grew up with a very poor family. We had 12 people living at home, and I have a PhD and I'm doing very well. So I tell them, well, who was at home? Well, it was grandmothers, uncles, aunts. I said, well, you were probably on the knees of 12 different people all the time. You were probably stimulated all the time. He goes, yes, you're right. So it's not the poverty that does it, it's the stress that the poverty brings you and the other associated factors that get in the way. So it's very important for us. TLC is free. TLC is free. Grandmother, uncle, aunt, anybody can do it. Anybody can do it. Yes, there has to be maternal and parental bonding, but anybody nurturing a child will help stimulate the brain. Any positive thing that we can do. So we need to have parents' education. They need to be emotionally aware. They need to have appropriate discipline. Read to a child, preschool. Those are all things that are very, very important. And so TLC is where it comes here. Those are the positive effects. And that's why when Harper asked me, what do you want to do? What do you want us to do? I said, I want all the parents to be able to hug their kids all the time. That's what I mean. But it means removing all the barriers remove all the socioeconomic and social determinants of health barriers that are getting in the way of them being able. They're not bad parents. They're just stressed and other things are getting in the way. We've got to understand that. So this is another slide, and that kind of shows sort of more a long-term approach as well. The blue arrow to the left is any insult. It could be physical, medical, a pill, a virus, but social toxic stress, so anything that occurs early on in life will actually have repercussions down the road. So what our goal is to be able to ensure that this blue arrow is as minimal as possible, try to minimize it by supporting the parents, because what we want to do is we want those on any function, whether it's the range of function of individuals, maintaining independence as elders, attaining highest possible function in a variety of things, any parameter that we look at, we want it to be as high as possible. And so what we see is the gap between the black line and the yellow line. We don't want that gap there. We want to push upwards as much as we can, because we believe by doing so, you're actually going to guarantee, or over the life perspective, that the child will be as well and as prosperous and successful as can be. So that's why I talk about early childhood development, TLC, the nurturing, and so on, over the life course. And I also talk about it being the key to lifelong health, wellness, and success. And that tells a lot in there. So it sounds very simple. Actually, it is, but it's harder to materialize. But I think that each and every one of us, understanding that you're doing very important work when you're looking at prenatal, postnatal care, and so on, and supporting this. So there is kind of a new framework, and I talked about an all-sectorial approach, right? In terms of looking and emphasizing supporting optimal early development through the lifespan. So essentially, it's functioning across the lifespan. It's a family and community and society and social planning and policy. There's a lot of these things that have to intermingle, and there's areas of expertise, and there's areas where you have, functioning, looking at developmental milestones, cognitive functioning, social expectations, relationships, community, society, all these things that play a role. All this to say that there has to be interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary connections and cooperation. Because you, as our family home visitor, or our PH, our public health nurse that visits home for healthy babies, healthy children's visit, in the public health unit, can't do much if the mother is stressed because they have no money. Is stressed because the husband is violent, because they're about to be kicked out of their house. We need to have those interconnections to be able to say, hey, this is an issue. And this is why when I told you about those EDI scores and the EDI score disparities, we have them here because we don't have that trans-sectorial network of support for the parents. Whereas in countries where there's no EDI disparity between rich and poor, you have that social blanket, the social coverage network, that net that can actually help the parents. So it's really important to understand that, and we can't do it alone. We need to work with each other and collectively. So when you look at the scenario that the Lancet does, nurturing care, promoting early childhood development. So it's nurturing care. That's what it is. It's nurturing care. And they're looking at 43% of the global kids population who are underdeveloped. It's huge significance for the future. It's a huge significance. So they define the nurturing care. What does nurturing care mean? And again, this is a real public health spin to it. I didn't write it, they did. So it's health, nutrition, security. I mean, those are the things that we do. Baby comes home, right? Health, nutrition, security. Responsive caregiving, very important. And early learning provided by, and this is the key, parent-family interactions that are supported, this is so important, by an environment that enables these interactions. All it's saying is, let's enable them to hug their baby. That's what it's saying in a very fancy way, which is what I've been saying all along. And this is the nurturing environment that we need to do. So it's not only health and nutrition and vaccines and all that other stuff. It's also injury prevention, the whole gamut of things we go through. When we do child checkup for baby care and first baby visit and so on. But it's very important for us to know that the family is intact, that their interactions are good, they're positive interactions, and that there are support systems out there that foster them to provide this nurturing environment. It's very important. Again, responsive caregiving. Very important. So, the Ferber technique is garbage. You don't let them cry it out. I've told them. You don't let it cry it out. You don't let babies cry it out. Studies have shown that crying can actually adversely affect the promotion of sculpting and brain sculpting. Yes?
Sorry, we're currently having these questions within our setting of early years by moms who are obviously under stress,
Sure.
do not sleep, about extinction cry. And they're so determined to go through it because they need to be able to sleep, to be able to function. We do have conversations around Ferber method and the extinction cry was the international theory. What kind of messages can we have to be more effective for them to reconsider the practice?
So extinction meaning progressively?
Cry
Oh, cry on. The crying method, there's other methods that you can do. There's progressive, going. Like we tell parents, okay, if you don't pick up the baby, at least go away the baby. Stay there a couple of nights. And then progressively go out. You're not damaging the baby, though. The baby gets used to it. That's the approach that I use as a pediatrician when I tell parents. Because what they can do is they can progressively do it. Now, there are situations where you're going to have to, it's not good if the baby cries because they don't treat the baby. That's the other thing. So we've got to balance that. It's not as easy as that. And you know that, I talked about it this morning, my colleague Ron Barr developed a purple period of crying. And we do know that babies cry, the peak around 2 or 3 months of age, and it goes away, and it's unconsolable purple, I forget, it's a whole acronym that it is. But he didn't know this, he noticed that the peak of Shaken baby syndrome happened almost at the same time as the peak of purple period of crying. So we need to identify those and give them alternate techniques how to soothe a crying baby or a baby that refuses to sleep. But letting them cry out won't work. I don't think it's a good technique. So this is an example of the Healthy Baby, Healthy Children's program. This is an example again of home visiting programs improving children's developmental outcomes. There's a lot of evidence to support this. And that's why I was very adamant and worked with the then Minister of Youth and Child Services when they retweaked the Healthy Baby, Healthy Children's program to allow public health units to go to the hospitals to actually visit the mothers. Because in our area, in certain areas, we don't have physicians available, and we're the only show in town, so it's good for them to know those services. And those are the high-risk people that we want to capture from the beginning. So the Lancet series, again, the key messages, I know it's a long slide, but it's important to know that the proportion of children younger than 5 years in low-income and middle-income countries at risk for not attaining the developmental potential because of poverty and stunting and so on is 43%. That's terrible. Now, we're not as high in Canada, but our child poverty rates are quite high, 10-20% in Canada. The accumulation of adversities, this is very important, adversities beginning before conception. Remember we talked about the 9 and 20 and 18 months. Continuing throughout prenatal and early life can disrupt brain development, attachment, and early learning. Developmental delays are evident in the first year, worsen during early childhood, and continuing through life. And we see those kids, these EDI scores. And that's too little too late. That's what we need to be doing. And they're saying, action on a global, national, local level is needed to increase political commitment and to investment in early child development. And this is where we can come in together and advocate. So my mantra is every parent needs to be able to hug their baby. While interventions will, and this is sort of a summary of the Lancet series. While interventions will continue to improve with the growth of developmental science, the evidence strongly suggests that parents, caregivers, and families need to be supported in providing nurturing care and protection in order for young children to achieve their developmental potential. That's what our goal is. That's what our goal is. We want to achieve it. And it's the right of every child. It's a human rights issue. Good early development is the right of every child. So we need to work together. We need to work together and advocate for this as much as we can. The Canadian context I can show you is that in Canada, we spend 0.6% of our GDP on early child support development. In the Scandinavian countries, it's 2%. So the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, 2004, issued a whole series of recommendations. One of them was at least get it to 1%, a bit higher. We need to recognize that it's important. And when you talk to politicians, they want to, and the other challenge that we have is that we're talking about investing now and getting the return 30, 40 years down the line. Their political terms are 4 years. So it's kind of difficult for us to go beyond that. It's easier to build a hospital, those type of things. But we need to go forward. And we need to have, we need to have an economic argument as well. And the TD Bank, the head economist of TD Bank, took a look at an economic argument and actually said that early childhood education and development has widespread and long-lasting benefits, and costed it out. And so that supporting the early years, with early childhood school, daycare and those type of things, and education, but just supporting the early years, it can result in, for $1 invested today, $7 return, but triple that in higher studies. So the rate of investment, the rate of return of investment, the ROI, is quite high. So we try to do that with the ministry, but their ROI will be only seen 10, 20 years down the line. But it's very important because we're building our future citizens. We're building our future, citizens, people that will be contributing to society. So it's very important for us to understand that we need to advocate together, and we need to have the economic argument ready, and we need to have the scientific argument ready. I think nobody can question that right now. We're at the point right now, and now it's going to be front and center. You'll be hearing more and more from the World Health Organization, from the United Nations about this, but it's not, I know it's 42% around the world, but we have our issues as well. So it's not acceptable that in this country we have kids that are not developing properly because of this issue. It's not acceptable. So just to conclude, I just want to think about a few things. The first 27 months of life are extremely important, 9 and 18. Now, people ask me, well, what are you going to give up on a 3-year-old or are you going to give up on a 4-year-old? Of course not. There's resilience and so on. My point is that it's easier to prevent it than to try to go back and reverse it. And sometimes you may not fully able to reverse it. You may not be able to fully bring that child up to that high curve that I talked to you about. Yes, we want to do our best. So it's better to do it earlier rather than later, and that's the upstream public health approach that we use. It has to be an all-sector approach. It can't be one discipline or one ministry. It's got to be looking globally. And we're working with, actually we're working both federally and provincially to have a child commissioner named in Canada and in Ontario. And we're working with the federal government, and there's going to be a private member's bill put out in the federal government. And there's actually a proposal that I have made with Dr. Clinton and Dr. Feller to have a child health commissioner that would probably oversee, kind of ensure that there's an intersectorial support that's needed for child health, because this is our future. So, really, normal child health and development is the key. We need to work together, and please advocate. Please advocate. And this is T.S. Eliot, in my beginning is my end, which is really true. Thank you very much.